Good morning. I'm Jim Norman. I have the pleasure of being here at the David Souter Conference Room of the New Hampshire Supreme Court to interview my good friend, strong New Hampshire attorney, George Bruno, who these days we call Ambassador George Bruno. George, I understand, unlike many of us in the bar, you didn't grow up in New Hampshire, and you didn't even go to school here in New Hampshire.
Right.
But you got to New Hampshire at some point in time and made a big difference. How did you get to New Hampshire?
I grew up in the Catskill Mountains in near a little town called Woodstock, New York, and went to law school in Washington, and by way of Newark, New Jersey, where I worked in the legal services program, I answered an ad in a law journal of an opening in New Hampshire to create a legal services program for the poor. I applied for it, came up, was interviewed by Ed McDermott and a few other people, and got the job.
To give us a little character and flair of the times, 1967. Is that the year you took the bar?
Yes.
Where did you take the bar?
Well, I've been a member of 4 bars, Washington, D.C., New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York. So at one point in my life, I was taking a bar exam every year. I waived into New Hampshire, though, by virtue of taking the job for legal aid.
Tell us about the times in Newark, New Jersey in 1967.
They were pretty rough days. They were the 1960s and early 1970s, the time of Vietnam protests, civil rights protests, love and peace were the dominant themes of the day. Love, peace, rock and roll, and it was pretty rough working in the Newark neighborhoods. I arrived shortly after the riots. I took the bar exam in New Jersey during the beginning of the civil disturbances. When during the bar exam, the main examiner said, urged us to write quickly because the city was on fire and the hotel room in which I was taking the exam began to fill up with smoke. He wanted us to write quickly because the last train was leaving the city in a half hour. And if we wanted to catch the train, we needed to finish up our bar exam.
And to nail down our history, there were famous Newark race riots and fires for 4 or 5 days in 1967, isn't that correct?
That's correct. And my first job as a lawyer was an assignment in Newark's Central Ward. I walked to the office on my first day over broken glass on the sidewalk.
Who was your first client?
My first client was the man that triggered the Newark civil disturbances upon his arrest. He was on the cover of Time magazine, and I was part of the 3-person team that tended to his legal affairs for a 2 or 3 year period.
I understand what, he was a cab driver or something?
He was a cab driver.
And arrested by?
And he was arrested, pulled out of his cab, put in a police car, taken to a back alley, beat up. And when word got around to the community, all hell broke loose.
So that's what triggered the race riots at that time?
That's what triggered the civil disturbances.
Oh, these days, civil disturbances.
of the city of Newark. And of course, Newark wasn't alone. Cleveland, Los Angeles, and other cities were also going through similar experiences.
So you became skilled in Legal Services Corporation in New Jersey, and you were called to come up to New Hampshire. What did you find up in New Hampshire?
I found a very peaceful, calm atmosphere. I was struck by the "Live Free or Die" slogan on the license plate. It was a totally different practice of law. in New Jersey, it was quite common when standing up in the courtroom for the judge and the lawyer to sort of raise their voice at each other. I won't say screaming, but talking loudly and vigorously, sometimes hostilely in these exchanges, was what characterized the practicing law in Newark. Totally different. I had to completely readjust my orientation when I came to New Hampshire and practicing law.
Now, tell us about New Hampshire Legal Aid, which is what it was called in those days. What did we have for legal aid and aid for the poor in criminal and in civil matters before you came?
Back in the 70s, New Hampshire had single lawyer legal aid offices. It was called Southern New Hampshire Southern New Hampshire Legal Services, and in the northern part of the state, it was Tri-County Legal Services. My mission was to come to New Hampshire to reinvigorate the whole legal aid process as part of, Sergeant Shriver's leadership on the war on poverty. These were the Johnson days, Lyndon Johnson, and so we formed the New Hampshire Legal Assistance, consolidated Tri-County Legal Services and Southern New Hampshire Legal Services into what is now New Hampshire Legal Assistance, with a model of two attorneys in every office, a paralegal, and a secretary. And we reduced the number of offices around the state from 11 to 5 in the major urban areas in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. And then we grew from there. At one point, New Hampshire Legal Assistance was the largest law firm in the state, if you can believe it.
And at that time, how many lawyers did you have?
We had 25 lawyers and a total staff of 75 people. We had funding sources from probably 25 different funding sources. Mm-hmm.
The largest law firm in the state, and I understand you established as part of the Legal Assistance Corporation subsets, like the Public Defender's Office?
Yes. I had a meeting one day with the state senator, Dick Leonard, who, prominent Nashua attorney, was upset that we were thinking of closing the Nashua legal aid office. And so he wanted to meet with me. I drove down to Nashua, met with him. And the discussion took a turn in which we started talking about the lack of legal counsel for criminal defendants in the state. And as lunch proceeded, we sketched out on a napkin how a public defender system would operate in the state under the umbrella of New Hampshire Legal Assistance. The following week, he went back to Concord, introduced a bill creating a pilot program for a public defender. It passed the legislature. I went about hiring an attorney from Washington, D.C., Public Defender Office, Paul Semple, and then other prominent attorneys, Bob Stein, I recruited from Philadelphia, Jim Duggan, who later became a member of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, was also one of my recruits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So did the whole tone of legal aid change from being an office that did divorces and some small work to taking on other institutions?
It changed completely. One of the missions of the day of the 1960s and 1970s was to look at society and the structural impediments affecting poor people with looking closely at at the welfare system, at the state prison system, all aspects of due process, mental health, the way children were put in the youth development center. And so we challenged all of these structural impediments and I think achieved a lot of benefits for society and made the administration of justice more fair. It didn't sit well with some members of the bar. I can remember at a meeting of the Manchester Bar Association where I was denounced quite vigorously by a prominent member of the bar who said that if I had my way, I would create socialized legal services in the state of New Hampshire, and that wouldn't be long before New Hampshire legal assistants would be representing General Motors. That, of course, didn't happen, but we did bring reform to the way mentally ill people were treated in New Hampshire, the way mobile home tenants were treated. We created the Mobile Home Bill of Rights. We challenged the way the nuclear power plant, Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant, was being built with a grant from, of all places, the Catholic Church.
Catholic Church gave legal aid.
Catholic Church gave legal aid $25,000, which, you know, back in the 70s was a lot of money. I hired a person by the name of Rick Cotton, the clerk for Justice Brennan, to lead that effort. And that is why there's only one nuclear power plant in New Hampshire today instead of two, which was originally planned. Today, Rick Cotton is the executive director of the Port Authority of New York. So we had a lot of talent in New Hampshire legal assistance. A number of people became judges, like Jim Duggan, and law professors like Bruce Friedman and Ellen Musinski, and others.
Okay. Now, to this day, I think you still have a consumer advocate on the Public Utilities Commission.
That was one of the, we had in New Hampshire Legal Assistance created a legislative office, and we had a lawyer in Concord, the way many businesses today have advocates and lobbyists in Concord. So we had one too, working for the poor. And one of the pieces of legislation that I'm proud that we were that we could facilitate was the creation of a public advocate at the Public Utility Commission.
And you know, to this day, 2022 June, we still have a consumer advocate on the Public Utilities Commission.
That's right, and it was facilitated by some real forward-thinking leaders in the state legislature. Bob Raish, Kim Anzakos, David Nixon, David Bradley were all prominent giants in the New Hampshire bar in those days that helped create a system of fairness and equal justice that lasts till this day.
And it's interesting, if I can note, in 1922 we have a little bit of a different politics, but 3 of the 4 legal giants that you mentioned were then Republicans.
Yes, that is true. And of course you were in the legislature in those days yourself, and Bill Gardner and a number of other young Turks anxious to make your mark and do good things for society.
And many of our best allies were moderate Republicans that made good law.
That is true.
Yeah. We jumped over your whole education and your beginning of life to get right into New Hampshire. Tell us about your education. Did you come from a family that promoted college education and law school?
I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I grew up in a hollow in the Catskills.
Hollow. I'm from New
A
Hampshire.
hollow is a road and a creek that runs between the base of two mountains, and so
I'm seeing water pumps and outhouses.
yeah,
Tell us about it.
all of that. I grew up on a farm, cows, chickens, pigs, turkeys. We sold eggs for income, and my mother was a waitress. My stepfather was a carpenter.
Eggs to college. How did you get to
I
college?
went to a two-room schoolhouse, but the saving thing in my life was a job that in a resort in the Catskills that was at the top of a mountain. I walked up 3 miles up a dirt road to ask for a job, and I got the job as a dishwasher, and later became a waiter, and the clientele of the hotel, of the resort, were mostly Jewish people from New York City. And there was a culture among them that everyone would be well educated and well spoken, and the constant question among them as I spoke to people was, well, what college are you going to go to? And so finally it spurred me and inspired me to go to college. I went to Hartwick College in the western Catskills near Cooperstown, and from there went to George Washington University, got my law degree, and following that got a fellowship to the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and ultimately under the fellowship was assigned to Newark Legal Services Project, where I worked for 3 years.
So that's how you got into it. Now, let's talk about Washington. We know now, in retrospect, that you subsequently were recognized by a president, became an ambassador. In your times in law school in Washington, which seems like a long ways from the hollow of Shandaken,
Right.
what did you experience in Washington? What type of things did you do, volunteer for?
I worked in Bobby Kennedy's office for a while, then, and also my congressman's office. I had internships at the Defense Department. I worked for the Polaris Missile Program under Admiral Redford, and I also worked as an intern at the State Department in the solicitor's office, which is a fancy word for the legal advisor at the State Department, up on the 6th floor. And so those were great experiences. I remember on one occasion at the end of one internship, I was offered the opportunity to fly down to Cocoa Beach in Florida to watch the launching of the first Poseidon missile, which is the successor to the Polaris missile program. And so we took a cruiser out to the ocean and watched the missile pop out of the surface of the water off Florida and land near Africa.
From a submarine?
From a Poseidon submarine, class
Okay.
submarine.
Okay.
And it was the first time I was ever on an airplane. So the next time I was on an airplane was when I was at Newark Legal Services Project, and they wanted a volunteer to go down to Washington to present records from Newark Legal Services Project's work during the civil disturbances. It was being investigated by a congressional committee, and so since I had just come from law school from Washington, they sent me down on the Eastern shuttle to deliver the documents.
In what state? To what state?
Sent me from Newark down to Washington, D.C. to the Congressional Committee.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Since you were the Washington guy.
Yeah, so that was a fun experience.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Let's talk about back to New Hampshire now. You were in Legal Assistance Corporation for a period of time. How long, and what else did you do in New Hampshire?
I left New Hampshire Legal Assistance and the public defender in 1976 to join the Carter-Mondale campaign. I did advance work for Fritz Mondale, mainly throughout the Midwest, traveling with him and facilitating his appearances, and of course President Carter won the election, and so I was invited to come down to Washington. I worked for a while at the Justice Department, and then for a while over at the White House in a justice reorganization program, and ultimately came back to New Hampshire and went into private practice with Ken Brown and Laura Kahn in Nashua, and then from there came up to Manchester and started my own firm.
And I understand while you were an attorney, you also got into publishing in New Hampshire.
I got into publishing. I created the New Hampshire Law Directory and Daybook. I created a newspaper called New Hampshire Law Weekly, which ultimately became what is today the Bar News. I handed it over to the bar at a certain point. It won some ABA awards for excellence.
As a young attorney, I remember reading it every day. I'd glance at it every day. It came in every week, so
Right.
you'd pick it up regularly and find out who's doing what and what the rule changes are.
Yeah,
It was helpful to have that.
it was quite a little enterprise, which and is today the media organ of the New Hampshire Bar Association.
And the day book you mentioned
And the Daybook on the desk of every lawyer in the
Right.
state,
and secretary.
And secretary. You wanted a telephone number, there it was, right at your fingertips.
That's
of
right.
Every lawyer and every governmental institution in the state of New Hampshire.
And we can remind our audience, computers were not even here at this point.
That's right.
Way into the future.
That's right.
Yeah, every secretary, every lawyer had a green book that had the telephone number of every lawyer in the state by alphabetical or by town.
That's right.
And then later, some new thing came into it. We would have a fax number.
Fax number.
That was new. It wasn't until the 80s.
Right. That's right. That's right.
George, you spent some time at the State Department as an internship, and you were going to get back to the State Department at some point in time as an ambassador. How did you get recognized by an American president who wanted you to represent the United States at some country around the world?
Well, this is the genius of New Hampshire in having the primary. When I came back from the Carter administration and went into private practice in New Hampshire, I became involved in politics. I got elected to the state committee, then from the state committee got elected party treasurer, and then after that got elected as the party chairman for 4 years, and even beyond that, a national committeeman for 12 years. And while I held these positions, I had the opportunity to meet many people running for President of the United States, governors, senators, congressmen, and one of the people I would invite to our dinners and conferences would be Bill Clinton. and he was just a fascinating character. I can remember one time I invited him to address the annual dinner of the Democratic Party called the 100 Club, and we were sitting in the Sheraton Wayfarer Hotel, which used to be in Bedford, following the dinner that year. We were totally exhausted. It was a complete sellout. We were there counting the receipts of the dinner at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door, and hello, anybody in there? Anybody up? And it was Bill Clinton, and he wanted to come in, and we shot the breeze for another hour till 3:30 in the morning with him just telling stories. And so when he was elected president, I was one of his New Hampshire co-chairmen, and was invited to again join the administration following his election. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the opportunities that's presented to people from New Hampshire. I met Hillary Clinton before I met Bill Clinton. Because Hillary Clinton was appointed chair of the Legal Services Corporation, the funding arm for legal aid around the United States. Mm-hmm. And so when I was the head of New Hampshire Legal Assistance, I would have interaction with Hillary Clinton from time to time.
Tell us about your service as ambassador. What did you do with your law firm that you had in New Hampshire?
I turned my law firm at that time over to Chris Dermer, a prominent Nashua attorney, and he did very well. And I, packed up my things, and Rona Zlakauer, my wife, and I, and my daughter, shipped our car and many of our belongings down to Central America, and took residence at the U.S. Embassy and stayed there for 3 years, dealing with such issues as stolen cars, guerrilla activity between Belize and the Guatemala border, dealing with alien smuggling, drugs coming up the Central American coast. We had a Voice of America station for all of Latin America in Belize. And so it's a little country, but it had a lot going on. One of my proudest efforts was inviting the U.S. military to Belize to engage in exercises with the Belize military, Belize Defense Forces, and together we built 13 schools around the country to the benefit of the Belizean people and for good training exercises for U.S. forces.
That was a Partnerships for Peace program? Is that what
that
was called?
Yes, it was part of that, and alongside of that, I organized something called the Summit of the Americas preliminary meeting, and drew in all of the ambassadors from Central America to prep for this major policy initiative to promote friendship between the United States and Latin American countries.
I remember when you had military exercises with the Belizeans that you also afforded the opportunity and invited the New Hampshire National Guard to spend several tours of duty down there.
I made a special effort to reach out to New Hampshire, and you were part of that effort. You were a designee of the Secretary of the Army, and so I was proud to have you in Belize as our guest.
I can tell you, New Hampshire National Guardsmen were proud to be there, proud to show what America can do, and we're really impressed to assist in the building of all of those schools for those young children.
That's very true, and the question often arises, why is the United States spending good money in foreign lands when we could be using that money to benefit U.S. citizens? And I would always be sure to give talks and have conversation with our visiting U.S. troops that we were making an investment. We were making an investment in peace, in the rule of law, in creation of civil society and capitalism, and it was in the United States' interest to do this.
Right. And I think it educated a whole lot of young soldiers in the National
Yes.
Guard in New Hampshire. They
That's
were proud
true.
to be there, and
Yes.
their eyes were opened. Tell me this, you have a 3-year tour of duty as an ambassador, that's the general term, but you stayed in federal government and in the State Department. You're sort of back at the State Department, like law school.
I did. Following my tour as a U.S. ambassador, I was offered the opportunity to go over to the Pentagon to do some work for NATO, and of course at that time the Soviet Union was breaking up, and there were all these new and independent countries trying to find their way in Eastern Europe.
Time period, late 90s?
Yes, that. And so I worked at the Pentagon in something called Partners for Peace, which was an offshoot of NATO to sort of promote democratic cultures and traditions among these new countries. Along with that, while I was at the Pentagon, I was also offered the opportunity to participate in the turnover of the Panama Canal. So for a 2-year period, I commuted between New Hampshire and Panama City to facilitate the implementation of the Carter-Torrijos Treaty, in which we turned over the Panama Canal to the Panamanian people at the beginning of the millennium, year 2000.
Is that a fulfillment of a 100-year-old commitment that America made?
Of course, we had the canal in perpetuity, and under the Carter administration, a treaty was entered into to turn over the canal and to promote peaceful relations once again with Latin American countries, and it was approximately a 25-year transition period in which the canal was turned over. So we turned over numerous military bases, schools, roads, all kinds of facilities. It was a little piece of America in the Panama Canal Zone.
It's now Panamanian?
Now totally Panamanian.
Okay. What else did you do, again, post-ambassadorship? I understood you were involved in a global civil rights movements and writing certain treatises on what is expected of humanity.
Sort of post-ambassadorship, I created a program called Diplomatic Observers to the New Hampshire Primary. With the help of people like Phil Walker and Betty Tamposi, we invited people, diplomats from Washington, to come to New Hampshire to observe democracy in action. And we would squire a delegation of about a dozen diplomats around the state to political events and dinners and again try to tell people from other lands and demonstrate to them what democracy was all about in New Hampshire and in the United States. And of course, today with so much of the partisan divide, our democracy is in a very fragile condition, and we need more programs like that to promote our democratic traditions and to try to ameliorate the partisan divide.
Now, when you came back initially came to quiet New Hampshire, and then came back to quiet New Hampshire, did you do any of the traditional things that New Hampshire lawyers usually do, and that's volunteer for local government and help? What types of things did you do in that area?
Yeah, I volunteered in the Bar Association, for example. I started the international section of the Bar Association. I was the board chairman of something called the New Hampshire Social Welfare Council. I was the vice chair of the Merrimack Zoning Board. In the tradition of the New Hampshire Bar and New Hampshire lawyers, I tried to do my part and volunteer efforts.
Did you serve an appellate judge, for example?
I served as the first judge of the New Hampshire Unemployment Compensation Board, appointed by Governor Hugh Gallen, and so I helped create and organize that board, and I did my best to bring fairness to the system of unemployment compensation benefits to workers and employers in the state of New Hampshire.
So after your service as ambassador and then your service to the national government in many ways around the world, you eventually came back to New Hampshire, did you not?
I did.
Yeah, what did you do?
And so this is my home, and I opened up a law practice concentrating in immigration law, and it was a way for me to continue to stay in touch with international affairs. And the practice of law was changing in those days. Typically, lawyers would meet and interview clients alongside their desk and, write down their notes on a yellow pad. The practice of law was changing very fast, and so everything was computerized. My clients were all over the world. I never met them personally. I used not only the telephone, but Skype and other computerized programs to deal with people all around the globe.
And what does an immigration lawyer do? Sitting in New Hampshire?
Well, the nice thing about it for me is that you have a global law practice, and an immigration lawyer helps unite families. It helps people fleeing from persecution find sanctuary in the United States. Helps employers bring workers to strengthen their business in the United States. So to me, it was a very rewarding new type of practice of law. And there aren't, to this day, very many people in New Hampshire that that practice immigration law. Some people have compared it to the IRS code in terms of complexity, but I found it not only challenging but invigorating, helping people come to the United States, establish themselves, and contribute to American society.
So there's not a big body of common law like we have for the rest of our law?
No, it's all statutory law and treaties that you have to deal with.
Okay.
I had the honor to, most recently, to represent a young man by the name of Chen Guangchen, who was a Chinese dissident, who was known as the barefoot lawyer, who railed against the China one-child policy, and for doing that was confined to house arrest for many years. At one point, he escaped from his house arrest, blind, traveled over 1,000 miles by way of a network comparable to what we would consider an underground railway, wound up in the U.S. Embassy seeking sanctuary, stayed there for several months until Hillary Clinton was passing through Beijing on trade negotiations, and while there she was able to negotiate, in addition, his transfer from sanctuary in the U.S. Embassy to the United States.
Was she Secretary of State?
She was Secretary of State at the time.
Under Barack Obama.
Yes,
Okay.
and he came over as a student, so to speak, with an F visa, associated with NYU in New York, but the NYU attorneys couldn't represent him any further than that because NYU had relations with China that they didn't want to disturb. And so by way of the Lantos Foundation and Dick Sweat and Katrina Lantos, who were managing a human rights foundation, Chen Guangchen found his way to them, they found their way to me, and I took over his representation, and from the F visa, we got him the O visa, then we got him the green card, and then most recently, naturalization. So most recently, I just came back from Washington celebrating his 10th anniversary of his arrival in the United States. He's quite an inspiring figure, and it was a pleasure to volunteer my legal services for him. And in a sense, it was a great bookend for me, representing the cab driver that sparked the civil disturbances in Newark, and whose picture was on the cover of Time magazine, to Chen Guangchen, this Chinese dissident who was recognized by Newsweek magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And starting my career fighting for civil rights, and sort of winding down my career fighting for human rights. So.
Well, starting in '67 to 1922, that's quite a career.
Yeah.
I understand you're not over yet.
Not over yet. I'm still handling some special immigration cases. I have a client in Karachi whose visa was taken away from him that I'm trying to get restored. And I have another client who served as a confidential informant for U.S. law enforcement, and after his services were done, the Immigration Service decided to deport him.
Thank you very
Despite the
much.
fact that they had offered him the ability to stay in the United States. So we've been litigating that in the First Circuit, and hopefully are reaching a settlement with the Justice Department.
Well, it's been exciting hearing about your practice, from representing the poor, taking the bar at a moment of civil unrest and the famous fires of Newark, New Jersey, 1967.
True enough.
To a reorganization of the legal aid system here in the state of New Hampshire, to representing regular mom and pops in their business practice until you become ambassador, and then taking on a global fair. You know, George, a lot of people want to be lawyers. A lot of mothers want their kids to be lawyers, and so on and so forth. Sometimes not for the right reasons. What message would you say to students, high school students, college students, law students who are seeking to be lawyers, and even young attorneys who are now trying to find their way? How do they find reward in their work while they're also pursuing some economic opportunities, which don't always give them those same rewards? What message would you send to those people?
I have maybe two messages. First, become involved. Become involved in your community. Volunteer. Do things to make your community stronger, better, and helping other people. The second thing I would say to people thinking about going into the law, it's a wonderful profession. I am so proud to be a lawyer. With a law degree and being a member of the bar is something very special. And you're imbued with the skills and the knowledge and the experience and the background that you can touch the levers of society and decision making, and promote change in society for the better. So it's a great tool to have, to be a lawyer, and with a law degree you can do anything.
Does a responsibility come with that?
But yes, responsibility comes with that. Making sure that people in society are treated fairly, that we encompass the idea of due process, and making certain that there is an element of justice and fairness as the way people are treated.
As you are continuing to practice law to some degree, I understand that you're spending time more with your family after many decades of law work.
That's true. I've enjoyed the wonderful support of my wife, Rona Zlakauer, who for many years was the Government and Community Relations Director of Digital Equipment Corporation, the largest employer in the state. And then from there went on to create something called Media Power Youth, to address the influence of media upon today's youth, which is a very important subject. And of course I have a wonderful daughter who works for Tufts University, and she has a great husband who's a surgeon at Mass General Hospital in Boston, and a little grandson that's almost 2 years old, who I like spending time with.
How often do you take care of them?
Every Thursday. If it's Thursday, it must be Grand Sunday.
Well, I look forward to that,
Yeah.
George. Thank you, New Hampshire attorney and Ambassador George Bruno.
Thank you for this
It has
discussion,
been
Jim.
very nice to speak to you, to learn about the hollows of New York, to the halls of justice. Even, I understand, you argued at the New Hampshire Supreme Court at one time.
New Hampshire Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court.
U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes.
Excellent.
And got a unanimous verdict,
Yeah.
a unanimous decision from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Did you make the world better?
Made the world better and secured Social Security benefits in that case for thousands of people around the United States.
George Bruno, New Hampshire attorney, but let me call you citizen of the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm James Norman, a Manchester attorney and a friend of George Bruno.